Imagine traveling back in time to a world without sodas, fast food, and pizzas delivered in minutes. A world where the aroma of freshly baked bread was a rare luxury, and food, something sacred, could determine your survival or your demise. The Middle Ages weren't just marked by bloody battles and imposing castles, but also by the peculiarity and scarcity of food. Now, get ready to discover the unusual foods that populated medieval tables. You'll never look at food the same way again after understanding what people truly ate back then. In the Middle Ages, soup was much more than a simple meal. It represented the foundation of a diet that was often limited, and in many regions, it was the only truly accessible food for the lower classes. Soups and stews were made with whatever was available, and the simplicity or complexity of these dishes depended on social class. For peasants, who lived in very harsh conditions, soups were basically made from grains, vegetables, herbs, and occasionally meat, when available. Most common was the use of vegetables like carrots, turnips, cabbage, garlic, and onions. Pork, chicken, or even game meat were added sparingly, and it was often salted or smoked meat, which helped preserve it longer. The broth for soups was made with water or meat stock, and in some cases, even goat or cow milk. But make no mistake, these simple broths had a flavor that was highly valued, as they represented not only the meal, but also a way to maintain necessary nutrients for the body in a time when food wasn't always guaranteed. Surprisingly, some medieval recipes even included unusual ingredients like fruits. Yes, fruits such as apples or pears could be used in savory soups and nuts, creating uncommon combinations for those accustomed to the simple soups we know today. Furthermore, herbs were a vital ingredient, not only for flavor but to ensure the soups had medicinal properties, something essential for health. If peasants made simple soups, nobles, of course, experienced much more sophisticated variations. Noble soups were often enriched with finer meats, like venison or pheasant, and seasoned with expensive spices such as pepper and cloves, which arrived from long journeys from the east. Additionally, a very common ingredient you probably wouldn't imagine was the use of bread, which was often soaked to thicken the soups. The mixture of bread, meat, vegetables, and spices created a dense and nutritious dish, essential for more robust meals. The concept of soup as a simple meal expanded into something more sophisticated over time, mainly due to the spice trade and improved culinary techniques that began to flourish at the end of the Middle Ages. With the growing use of ingredients like saffron, cardamom, and even almonds, stews and soups became a dish fit for royal banquets. When we talk about meat in the Middle Ages, the modern vision of fresh, easily accessible meats is very far from medieval reality. Meat consumption was a privilege for a few, and how it was eaten varied immensely between social classes and regions. Fresh, juicy, and flavorful meat was not within everyone's reach. In fact, for most of the population, quality meat was a rare commodity. For nobles, meat was synonymous with luxury. During grand feasts and banquets such as those held in castles and manors, meat was the main course and could be served in spectacular ways. The priciest cuts of meat, like venison, wild boar, pheasant, and even swan, were elaborately prepared and served in large quantities. Nobles spent fortunes on imported spices and ingredients to give an exotic touch to meats, which were often roasted, boiled, or stewed in improbable combinations with fruits, wines, and in some cases even honey. But if meat was a luxury for the rich, for peasants, the reality was quite different. Poorer people couldn't even dream of fresh meat, and most of the time relied on salted or smoked meat, like pork, which stayed preserved for long periods. Salt was an essential ingredient in meat preservation, allowing it to be stored during colder months, when hunting or raising new animals was more difficult. In fact, many peasants consumed meat only on special occasions or during winter, when food scarcity made meat more precious. Another interesting point is that during military campaigns, armies also depended on meat, but in a very different way. When knights and soldiers set off for the Crusades or other expeditions, fresh meat was practically impossible to transport for long periods. Therefore, meat was preserved by methods like sun-drying or salting. Soldiers, for the most part, carried dried meat, which could be rehydrated and cooked in broths or soups, with the minimal resources available. However, on some expeditions, you'd be surprised to learn that even camel meat was consumed during the Crusades, as it was more accessible in the distant lands of the Middle East. Nevertheless, meat was also a status symbol. Contrary to what many think, it wasn't just kings who ate high-quality meat. The very act of eating meat was, in a way, a sign of prosperity. And it was precisely this association that helped reinforce the idea that certain cuts and types of meat were destined only for specific groups, such as the nobility or the military class. But the most curious thing is that even among the wealthy, there were variations in preferences, and some less valued meats, like donkey or even dog meat, were surprisingly consumed in some regions. Ultimately, meat consumption in the Middle Ages reflected not only social class, but also the technological and geographical limitations of the era. Those who had access to fresh meat often went through a complex preparation process to ensure its preservation, and those without this privilege had to content themselves with simpler meats, preserved by rudimentary methods. In the Middle Ages, fish played a vital role in the diet, especially due to religious rules and the scarcity of other types of meat. During the medieval period, the Catholic Church directly influenced dietary choices, and one of the most notable impositions was fasting, a religious practice that prohibited the consumption of red meat and poultry on certain days of the week, especially during Lent and other religious observances. In this context, fish became a fundamental alternative, consumed by people of all social classes. But here's the mystery. In the Middle Ages, fish wasn't just a common food. In some regions, it transformed into a true delicacy, a luxury item inaccessible to everyone. What's most surprising is that, although fresh fish was abundant, salted and dried fish were much more popular and frequently consumed. Fish was basically preserved in a way very similar to meat, through salting or sun-drying, which allowed its preservation for long periods. Fishermen, especially in coastal regions or along rivers and lakes, had a tough job. They needed to catch fish quickly, as without proper refrigeration methods, fresh fish spoiled rapidly. Therefore, salting or drying fish was the only way to ensure it remained edible for longer. But, as you might imagine, the quality of salted and dried fish varied. While common fish like cod and mackerel were consumed regularly, fish like sturgeon, considered rarer and tastier, became a true symbol of status among the nobility. The church also had its own rules when it came to fish. Besides being a permitted option on fasting days, fish was associated with spiritual purification, and thus became a food frequently consumed by the devout. During Lent, people ate fish not only out of necessity, but also as part of a spiritual ritual that reinforced the idea of body and soul purification. However, fish consumption wasn't limited to coasts and rivers. In many inland areas, far from the source of fresh fish, people resorted to a rather peculiar practice. Freshwater fish, such as carp and catfish, were raised in fish ponds or small artificial lakes. These fish ponds were, in a way, a medieval technology to ensure a constant supply of fish throughout the year, regardless of the season. As simple as they may seem, these fish ponds were a clear example of how medieval communities began to adapt their food practices to ensure a continuous source of protein, even in regions furthest from the coast. The most curious thing about fish consumption in the Middle Ages, however, is that it was far from being a choice only for peasants or the religious. During grand banquets and feasts, exotic fish were presented as noble dishes. Imagine banquets where fish like sturgeon were served, which, besides being tasty, was seen as a symbol of opulence. These fish were prepared in sophisticated ways, often with marinades, spices, or even fruits, to create an explosion of flavors that impressed guests. and in some cases, even the presentation of the fish was a work of art, with the whole fish served with its head, fins and tail intact, in a display of wealth and grandeur. But while fish was an essential part of the medieval diet, it wasn't equally accessible to everyone. The wealthier could afford fresh fish, while the lower classes consumed dried or salted fish, and as mentioned earlier, fish was also an excellent source of protein on days when meat was prohibited. It was almost as if fish had a duality. At the same time it was a staple food, it also became a luxury depending on how it was prepared, served and consumed. In the Middle Ages, the peasant diet was much simpler than that of the nobles, and what they ate was closely tied to what they could grow or access in their region. Unlike today, where we have an abundance of fruits and vegetables year-round, medieval people depended on a very restricted growing cycle and a diet marked by seasonality. Most fruits and vegetables consumed at the time were locally produced, and peasants made the most of what they could cultivate on their land. Firstly, fruits were a greater luxury than we imagine. Although fruit trees were scattered across the countryside and in house gardens, often they only bore fruit once or twice a year, and varieties were limited. The most common fruits were apples, pears, apricots, plums, and cherries. They were used fresh when available, but a good portion of the harvest was also preserved by drying or cooking into compotes and jellies, a vital resource for the winter months. However, what's most surprising is that exotic fruits like figs, grapes, and even peaches could be seen in the gardens of nobles and clerics. These fruits, often brought from the East, were considered a symbol of status and were not accessible to the majority of the population. For the lower classes, fruits were a form of natural sweetness, and in some cases, a little honey or sugar might be used to enhance the flavor. The scarcity of exotic fruits made them highly valued, and at banquets, they were served elaborately, as part of the great medieval culinary spectacle. In the fields, peasants were more dependent on easily grown vegetables, such as cabbage, kale, onions, garlic, turnips, and carrots. These plants were hardy and could be cultivated for most of the year, being consumed in various ways, cooked, in soups, stews, or even dried for later consumption. Garlic, for example, not only was part of many soup and stew dishes, but was also seen as a natural remedy for various ailments. Additionally, cabbage was one of the few vegetables that could be stored for long periods, as it withstood the cold well and could be eaten fresh or fermented. Another curious detail is that herbs also played a central role in medieval cuisine. They were used both to season food and for medicinal purposes. Rosemary, sage, mint, and spearmint were just some of the herbs cultivated in vegetable patches and gardens near homes. Besides flavoring dishes, they were also valuable for medieval medicine, used in infusions and natural cures for various illnesses. It's fascinating to realize that, although fruits and vegetables were limited in variety, there was a deep knowledge of how to preserve and optimize the use of seasonal foods. In spring and summer, peasants harvested fresh produce and made the most of their yields, while in autumn and winter, preservation techniques like drying and salting were essential to ensure there was something to eat when the cold season arrived. The most curious thing of all, however, is that certain foods now considered basic or common, like potatoes and tomatoes, had not yet been introduced into the medieval diet. These foods, so present on our tables today, would only arrive in Europe centuries later, after contact with the Americas, making the medieval diet even more limited in options. In the Middle Ages, bread was not just a basic food, it was the main source of sustenance for most people. It was consumed at almost every meal, and its importance in the medieval diet cannot be overstated. However, medieval bread did not resemble what we know today, with its golden crusts and soft crumbs. Medieval bread was much simpler, rustic, and varied enormously depending on social class, region, and available ingredients. For peasants, bread was generally made from cheaper grains, such as rye, wheat, or even barley, depending on what was locally available. Rye, for example, was the most common grain for peasant bread, as it was easier to grow in poor soils and more resistant to the climate. This rye bread was dense, heavy, and often a little sour, due to natural fermentation. Nobles, on the other hand, had access to better quality wheat, which allowed them to make lighter, whiter, and tastier breads. Wheat was a symbol of wealth, and bread made from it was considered more refined. These more delicate breads were prepared more carefully and often baked in special ovens, which helped create a crispy crust and a softer crumb. But the most interesting thing is that, besides wheat and rye, medieval breads were prepared with a variety of other grains, such as oats and spelt, an ancient type of wheat. Spelt bread, for example, was more expensive and preferred by the upper classes for its distinct flavor. On days when wheat or rye were unavailable or too expensive, oat bread was the peasant's option. Despite not being as tasty as wheat bread, it was still an important source of carbohydrates and calories. Medieval bread was simple, but it wasn't limited to just flour and water. Often, it was enriched with other ingredients. A curious example is the use of spices and herbs to give the bread more flavor. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, and even garlic were incorporated into the dough, creating breads with complex flavors. There were also medicinal breads, prepared with ingredients that supposedly helped treat ailments, such as the use of ginger or other aromatic herbs to relieve stomach aches or digestive problems. Furthermore, bread in the Middle Ages was not restricted to the traditional form of slices. In fact, peasants often used pieces of bread as plates. They cut large slices of bread, which served as a base for soups or stews, or even to wipe up food scraps from dishes. Bread was also used as a type of utensil, especially at large banquets. People used pieces of bread to pick up food or, in a simpler gesture, to soak up broths and juices from the plates. However, the most surprising thing is that bread was not just a source of food, it had deep symbolism. During the Middle Ages, bread was considered a gift from God, an essential blessing. This explained why it was treated with such respect and even ceremony. Bread was seen as an element of faith, especially in the context of churches, where the bread of the Eucharist represented the body of Christ. As such, many peasants believed that bread should not be wasted and should be shared among family and community as an expression of unity and faith. Besides the simple and rustic bread consumed by most of the population, there were luxury breads. These were breads made with more refined ingredients, such as sugar, butter, and spices. During grand noble banquets, breads were often served with sweet toppings or accompanied by meats and pâtés. On some occasions, bread was even sculpted into elaborate shapes, such as animals or hunting scenes, to impress guests and showcase the host's wealth. In the Middle Ages, beer wasn't just a popular drink, it was essential for survival and played a fundamental role in daily diets. For many, especially in Central and Northern Europe, beer was consumed as frequently as water, and its production was deeply rooted in medieval culture. But what makes medieval beer so intriguing? First, medieval beer was not like what we consume today. Most medieval beers were much cloudier and stronger, with a unique flavor and often more bitter than modern beverages. Furthermore, the alcohol content was much lower, ranging from 2 to 6% alcohol, which made the drink safer than water, which was often contaminated and caused diseases. In an era where hygiene wasn't a priority, beer fermentation was a process that helped kill bacteria and other impurities present in water, making it more potable for daily consumption. But what truly highlights medieval beer is the fact that it was consumed by people of all ages and social classes. Even children drank a more diluted version of beer, with almost non-existent alcohol content, while adults consumed the beverage in large quantities. Unlike today, where beer is often associated with leisure or celebrations, in the Middle Ages it was a daily necessity, an integral part of the diet. Beer was made from simple ingredients like barley, water, and hops. But surprisingly, the use of hops in medieval beer wasn't as common as we think. In reality, hops would only become the main flavoring for beer after the Middle Ages. Initially, brewers used a combination of herbs, such as rosemary, fennel, and even mint, to flavor the drink, creating a variety of tastes and aromas. However, as the hop trade expanded, the drink began to acquire the characteristic flavor we know today. Beer production, like grain cultivation, was deeply linked to large abbeys and monasteries. Monks, in particular, were the primary producers and experts in beer during the Middle Ages. Many monasteries had their own breweries, where they produced the beverage for internal consumption and also for sale. In fact, some of the first quality beers that survived through the centuries were made in monasteries, and their recipes were considered state secrets. Medieval beer was therefore almost sacred, a product that reflected the devotion and knowledge of the monks. And although beer was widely consumed, it also had symbolic value. During religious festivals, for example, beer was served in abundance, not only as a drink, but also as an act of celebration and community sharing. In some cases, beer was even used in religious ceremonies, and during noble banquets, the consumption of high-quality beer was a sign of status. Another interesting aspect is how beer transformed over time. In some regions, like Germany, the use of wheat malt, or even other grains besides barley, was common. Some medieval beers were thicker and more nourishing, serving as a true liquid meal. They were consumed with soups, breads, and other heavy foods, functioning as a source of calories and nutrition, especially in colder months. But medieval beer was not limited to daily consumption. During fairs and markets, it was common to see barrels of beer being sold, and peasants and merchants could acquire beer in large quantities. In fact, in some localities, breweries became almost as essential as bakeries, providing the necessary beverage for the sustenance of the population. And with the growing popularity of beer, the first commercial breweries emerged, especially in larger cities. In the Middle Ages, sugar was a rare and expensive item, and sweets, as we know them today, were far from being a common part of daily diets. In fact, sugar wasn't available in all homes, and modern methods of sweetening and confectioning were unknown. Instead, medieval desserts were made from fresh or dried fruits, honey, and in some cases spices, offering a sweet experience completely different from what we're used to today. For most of the Middle Ages, sugar was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford. It was imported from distant lands, such as India and the Middle East, and because of this, its cost was exorbitant. When available, it was often used in a limited way, mainly at royal banquets or noble feasts. For the majority of the population, the idea of consuming something sweet daily was practically non-existent. What the lower classes had as sweets were honey, dried fruits, and compotes. Honey, which was widely accessible, was the primary way to sweeten foods in the Middle Ages. Honey was used to make simple sweets, like cakes and tarts, or even to coat fruits like figs and dates. Dried fruits were also quite common, and peasants frequently preserved their fruit harvests, such as apricots, figs, grapes, and apples, by drying them or marinating them in honey, thus creating a kind of natural sweet. Additionally, fresh fruits, like apples, cherries, and pears, could be cooked with honey to create simple but tasty desserts. However, the true sophistication of medieval sweets appeared at royal banquets and feasts. During these occasions, sugar, though still rare, was used to create elaborate desserts, often decorated with intricate shapes and filled with exotic ingredients. One of the most impressive desserts of this era were the subtleties, which were decorative sweets made of marzipan, almond paste, or even sugar. These creations were meant to be more ornamental than edible, with shapes imitating animals, plants, and even castles. Subtleties were served at large-scale banquets and were considered a demonstration of wealth and power. They weren't simply consumed as desserts. Often they were made to be admired and even displayed before being eaten. The presence of rare sugar and spices in these desserts reflected the privileged position of those who consumed them. For peasants, however, these sweet marvels were completely inaccessible. Furthermore, another form of medieval sweet was directly linked to medicine. For centuries, people believed that certain sweet foods had healing properties. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, which were already very expensive and not very accessible, were incorporated into sweets to supposedly improve health and digestion. Desserts were a combination of pleasure and cure, with recipes that balanced sweet flavors and medicinal properties. Another fascinating aspect of medieval sweets was how medieval cuisine utilized preserved fruits. Preserved foods like fruits in compote were a way to ensure fruits were available during colder months when harvests were scarce. Besides aiding preservation, fruits preserved with honey or spices were also a form of medieval sweet and were appreciated at banquets and festivities, where the sweet taste was highly valued. The most intriguing thing about medieval sweetness, however, is that the absence of accessible sugar for everyone didn't prevent people from creating delicious sweets with the resources they had. Even with few ingredients, the creativity in medieval kitchens allowed for the creation of sweets that, though simple, provided a unique experience. Sugar as a rare commodity only became popular much later, but until then, people learned to value other flavors and textures to make their sweets. If there's one thing that characterizes medieval food, especially for the wealthy, it's spices. They weren't just used to flavor food, but also to display power, wealth, and sophistication. For much of the Middle Ages, spices were as valuable as gold, imported from distant lands in the East and Africa through complex trade routes that connected the Middle East to Europe. However, access to these products was highly restricted, and spices were considered a privilege of nobles and the church. What makes spices so fascinating is their impact on medieval cuisine and society at the time. They were used in savory and sweet dishes, in soups and meats, and also as preservatives and remedies. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and ginger were some of the most coveted and expensive spices. They transformed simple dishes into exotic delicacies and offered the rich a chance to differentiate themselves from peasants, who rarely had access to these ingredients. Spices were not only consumed by the nobility as part of their daily diet, but also played a fundamental role in medieval medicine. Nobles frequently used spices to cure illnesses or improve digestion, believing in their magical and therapeutic properties. Cinnamon, for example, was seen as a cure for colds and stomach problems, while ginger was used to improve blood circulation. Spices were, in a way, a symbol of health and vitality. For the poor, spices were practically unattainable, and most of the population depended on local and simple herbs to season their food. Peasants contented themselves with garlic, onions, leeks, and other plants grown in their gardens. For them, the use of spices was a luxury reserved only for royal banquets or special occasions. However, in some regions, spices like cumin and cilantro were more accessible and were part of soup or stew recipes, but on a much more modest scale. The church, in turn, played an important role in the distribution and control of spices, as they were frequently used during religious ceremonies. The use of spices in food preparation was also a way to glorify food and spiritual rituals. The connection between the church and spices was so deep that at times, monasteries were the only places where spices were cultivated and processed. Royal banquets were occasions where the use of spices reached its pinnacle. Dishes served in castles were elaborate with rare spices, like black pepper, which was freshly grated and used to season roasted meats, fish, and even sweets. The use of nutmeg and cloves was common in sophisticated desserts and festive dishes. A mixture of pepper, cinnamon, and ginger, called powder douce, was a popular seasoning at banquets and was used to give an exotic and rich touch to the meal. But the use of spices was not limited to food. They were also fundamental in food preservation, especially for meats. Salt, which was already widely used, was combined with spices to ensure that meat remained in good condition during long journeys or periods of scarcity. Meats were soaked in salt and spices to prevent them from spoiling, a process that extended to dried fish and even preserved fruits. Indeed, the presence of spices in medieval cuisine can be seen as a reflection of a world in search of new flavors, a symbolism of status and wealth, and a desire to transform everyday foods. The simple fact of having access to a small amount of pepper or nutmeg was enough for a dish to become a luxury. And the nobility knew this. A meal well seasoned with expensive spices not only pleased the palate, but also affirmed their social position, their connection to the East, and their ability to pay for these rare products. During the Crusades, soldiers and knights were away from home for months, even years, facing unknown terrain, food shortages, and extremely difficult living conditions. How did they manage to sustain themselves amidst these long and dangerous journeys? Food during the Crusades was a matter of survival, and sustenance was often as scarce as the possibilities of finding resources in distant lands. When armies set out on expeditions, supply logistics became one of the greatest challenges. Transporting food was a complex task, and soldiers depended on foods that were easy to carry, durable, and could be prepared simply. Fresh meat was a rarity, and the meat that was available was for the most part dried, smoked, or salted meat, like beef, pork, and even goats. The drying or salting process was essential to ensure that the meat remained edible for long periods, withstanding the rigors of travel and the lack of proper preservation. Among the most consumed foods during the Crusades were grains and cereals, like wheat and barley, which were the base of their diet. Barley especially was common in soups and porridges. These grains were carried in large quantities and used to make simple breads or gruels. Coarse grain flour was mixed with water, forming a kind of rustic dough that was simply cooked. Bread, as at home, was one of the most consumed foods, but its quality varied. Many soldiers were accustomed to eating hard, unleavened bread, something that lasted longer, but was very difficult to swallow. Besides grains, soldiers also carried hard, salted cheeses, which held up well during journeys. Cheese not only served as a source of protein and fat, but was also more durable and often provided a more intense flavor to complement simple meals. What's surprising, however, is the variety of foods that the Crusades brought back to Europe. As armies marched through eastern lands, they came into contact with new ingredients, spices, and culinary techniques that would be incorporated into medieval kitchens. The interaction with the Muslim and Byzantine worlds brought a series of new foods that would begin to be part of the medieval diet, such as citrus fruits, rice, nuts, and even sugar. During the journey, the Crusades became a cultural exchange, and many ingredients that were previously unknown became an important part of the European diet. The idea of exotic food and spices from the East was one of the most striking legacies of the Crusades. Peppers, cinnamon, and other spices began to be more widely accessible to Europeans, and this had an immediate impact on cuisine. Not only nobles, but also some cities began to import spices more consistently, bringing new flavors to medieval food. New dishes and seasonings, adapted from Arab and Persian influences, began to be incorporated into the diets of the upper classes and even merchants. However, conditions for soldiers were not always so prosperous. During the Crusades, food was not always guaranteed, and many soldiers went hungry during significant parts of the journey. The lack of fresh food and the difficulty in maintaining a balanced diet resulted in illnesses and nutritional deficiencies. Many knights and soldiers fed on roots, herbs, and any other food they could find along the way, a reflection of the extreme difficulties they faced. The most impressive thing is that the Crusades not only changed diets, but also trade and relations between East and West. Food products, such as spices and fruits, began to be seen as precious items and were traded along commercial routes. The result was a revolution in food and seasoning consumption, which would profoundly transform European cuisine in the following decades and centuries. Now that we've seen how the Crusades affected food, we can ask ourselves, how did travel and cultural contacts shape medieval European food? How did soldiers deal with food shortages while bringing new delights and flavors from the East? Let's move forward and explore the impact of the exchange of foods and culinary techniques on medieval eating habits, and how this led to the evolution of modern food. The Middle Ages was a time of transition, not only in the social and political spheres, but also in food. Although many of the era's eating practices survived for centuries, the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance brought significant changes to the European palate. These changes, which started slowly, were shaped by various influences, among them the Crusades, the Renaissance, and the great voyages of discovery that would begin to expand the horizons of international trade. As a result, medieval food, limited in variety and ingredients, began to transform, paving the way for the modern diet. Before the end of the Middle Ages, food was marked by simplicity and scarcity. Rare ingredients, like sugar and spices, were the privilege of a small elite, while most people depended on simple foods, such as grains, vegetables, dried meats, and bread. Contact with the East, especially during the Crusades, brought new spices, fruits, and culinary techniques that began to change traditional recipes. But it was with the great geographical and commercial discoveries of the 15th century, like the arrival of Christopher Columbus's and Vasco da Gama's ships, that medieval food began to be enriched with a variety of new foods. The arrival of foods from the Americas was one of the most transformative events for European eating habits. Products like potatoes, tomatoes, bell peppers, corn, cacao, and beans, which became essential in the Western diet, were unknown until then. These ingredients not only transformed European dishes, but also had a profound impact on agriculture, initiating the agricultural revolution that would occur in subsequent centuries. The potato, for example, would become a staple food for millions, especially in poorer areas, where grain shortages made potato cultivation a practical and nutritious solution. The exchange of food between the old and new worlds was not just an exchange of ingredients. It also represented a change in the concept of food and the way ingredients were combined. The Renaissance, with its rebirth of arts and sciences, also led to the evolution of culinary techniques. New ideas about nutrition and gastronomy began to be introduced into European kitchens, and chefs started to experiment more, mixing flavors and creating more sophisticated dishes. Furthermore, the rise of the middle class and the development of the spice trade began to make these exotic ingredients more accessible. Another crucial factor was the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which brought new methods of mass production, storage, and transport of food. This not only made food more accessible, but also improved the living standards of the lower classes. Processed foods, such as refined flours, canned meats, and lighter breads, became popular, marking a significant change from the medieval diet. This, however, also brought new challenges, such as the growing dependence on industrialized foods and the loss of some food traditions. Over time, the concept of fast food and convenience began to gain traction. Although medieval foods, with their robust flavor and preservation techniques, were practical and sustainable, modern food, for the most part, would move away from this rusticity. With advancements in culinary techniques, increased imports, and the creation of new food industries, the medieval palate was gradually replaced by a more complex, but also more standardized. And so, medieval food, with its simple soups, rustic breads, salted meats, and exotic spices, was transformed. What was once a reflection of survival, with the ingenious use of simple ingredients, was gradually replaced by more refined dishes and a globalized cuisine, where influences from all continents would meet. However, the roots of this simple and flavorful food never completely disappeared, and even today, we can find echoes of medieval food in kitchens worldwide, especially in homemade food traditions and rustic dishes. So when we look at medieval food, we realize that it was more than just a reflection of scarcity or necessity. It was a cuisine of adaptation, creativity, and social symbolism, which over time paved the way for the development of modern cuisine, which continues to evolve and diversify to this day. This food transformation leaves us with an intriguing question. In a world of innovations and food convenience, can we still learn something from the practices of the Middle Ages when it came to making the most of what the land and nature offer us? And more importantly, how has this relationship with food shaped our current view on sustainability and conscious consumption? Let's reflect on this as we move forward to new food and cultural discoveries that may emerge in the future.